In today's gospel reading, our Lord tells us that anyone who wants to become his follower must deny himself and take up their cross daily and follow after our Lord. In other words, live their lives the way that our Lord calls us to. And notice how he goes on to say, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. So it's clear that he's talking about persecution that may come to Christians, to the followers that he has. And especially when we realize that he makes this statement in the context of just having revealed that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. In other words, he's saying that his followers will also face very severe persecution and may even lose their lives. So, are we willing to lose our lives for the sake of our faith? Are we willing to face persecution for the sake of our faith? And if we are, then of course we're not afraid to speak out against injustices in society. But if we are afraid to lose our life, then that means we will also be afraid of any opposition, or most even minor opposition. So it's important that we have this willingness. Now, there's no guarantee that we will ever persevere if and when persecution should come, should it be very severe. So we can only hope in God, in God's grace, and dispose ourselves to have the right attitude by speaking out against injustice at this time. So there's no guarantee, and we can only pray God to help us to persevere. But I wanted to kind of focus on something else that our Lord says, or a different aspect of what he says. In other words, when our Lord says that if we want to be his followers, we need to deny ourselves and to take up our cross daily and follow after our Lord. So whether there is persecution or not, this is something that pertains to the life of every Christian. In other words, as Christians, we have to deny ourselves, we have to take up our cross, and we have to follow our Lord. And this is something that is not easy, and it's not something that naturally appeals to us. In other words, taking up our cross and following after our Lord, it entails labor, it entails pain and suffering. And our natural inclination is to avoid pain and suffering. And in fact, the natural inclination of most people is also to avoid work and labor. Most people are kind of inclined towards laziness. Now, it is true that some people love their work, some people love doing their work also, and that's wonderful. And that's a very good thing. So sometimes we love our work because our work is something that appeals to us, but also because we've learned over time that waking up at a certain time, going to work or doing our work, it can be very fulfilling, not just because you get a paycheck, but because you know you've done something good. And that's actually a good thing. And that's how it should be. But you know that in order to get up on time, to get to work on time, to get your work done, it requires a certain amount of self-denial, a certain amount of sacrifice. Think of little children, for example. Usually they love to play, and to play is easy. But when it comes time for work, they don't want to do it. When their parents tell them to clean their room, to put their toys away, very often they don't want to do it. Why? Because it's not fun. It's not appealing, it's not fulfilling, it's not pleasurable. It requires labor, it requires work. And it also means an end to play. But what happens when children do not obey their parents? I mean, let's just take the example of parents asking their children to put their toys away. Imagine if children never put their toys away and they get more and more toys, and eventually there's toys all over the room, and what's going to happen? Well, you're probably going to trip or fall over your toys. You might break some of your toys. Dust will accumulate. You won't be able to clean your room, and eventually it's going to be not good for you. On the other hand, when children put their toys away, it's much more orderly, much more neat, much more tidy. You appreciate your toys more. When you do play and take out your toys, you appreciate them more. You take care of them. You realize that they're valuable. They have a place. It's not just to be kicked or strewn on the floor. And it's the same with every aspect in our lives. In other words, our inclination is towards laziness. We would prefer to sleep in. We would prefer not to have to say our prayers. We would prefer not to have to work, but just to have $1 million. It's part of the reason a lot of people want to win the lottery. So we have this natural inclination towards laziness, and that's not good for us. So we need to work, we need to be disciplined, to wake up on time, to say our prayers can be difficult. But when we do these difficult things, good things result. Just like the individual who's a hard worker, gets their paycheck, feels good because they've done their work. Same as with children who keep their rooms tidy and neat and put their toys away. In the long run, they're better off than children who just scatter their toys all over the place. And so it is with every aspect in our lives, but especially in regards to our spirituality. So not only are we inclined towards laziness, but we're also inclined towards those things that are pleasurable. Being lazy is pleasurable. Sleeping in is pleasurable. So when we go against our natural inclinations, when we don't indulge our passions, we're practicing self-denial. It's a kind of suffering. It's a kind of cross. And we are making the effort to follow our Lord. To give of ourselves for the good of others also requires sacrifice. The sacrifice of our time, the sacrifice of our energy, the effort to actually love a person. But all of these things are extremely rewarding. When it comes to our selfishness and self-indulgence, we like immediate gratification. So those things that give us pleasure, and often it can be sinful things. Let's just take the example of someone who overeats or eats throughout the day or is just always snacking on sweets. Well, it's very pleasurable. But in the long run, we know it's not going to be good for them. But there's that immediate gratification. There's that immediate satisfaction. And the person becomes habituated in this kind of living, and usually when they realize it's becoming a real problem, it's hard to overcome that habit. So the ideal is that we avoid these bad habits at the beginning stages, because the longer they persist, the harder they are to overcome. But the person who denies themselves food when they feel like eating, well, they're going to be healthier in the long run. They're going to be in better shape. They're going to have less health issues because they're not eating junk food. They're not eating all the time. But what I wanted to emphasize by this is that when we give in to our selfish inclinations, we have immediate gratification, but long-term negative consequences. On the other hand, when we deny ourselves and do what is difficult, such as saying our prayers or avoiding eating when we feel like eating, when we shouldn't be eating, then in the long run, we're better off, much more happier, but it's not as noticeable at the present moment. So we need to understand this. And it's very important that we understand it, because we can be deceived by the satisfaction that we derive from immediate pleasures and consolations. We need to look long term. We are looking for happiness in the long term. That's the kind of happiness that truly fulfills us and makes us happy. And we can attain that even here and now, provided we make the effort to deny ourselves, to take up our cross, in other words, do things that are difficult and laborious, but good for us, and to follow our Lord, which also entails practicing charity, giving of ourselves for the good of others.